Hi everyone. I guess the next talk is going to be kind of in a similar line in terms of sharing my learnings in terms of say what does it take to actually build, say not just an ML feature, but say something that actually impacts user, right? Something that's actually helping say users in a significant way, right? And we'll also talk about in terms of say my learnings that came with say building say traditional ML features. I've been doing this for the last 15 plus years, and how that is kind of changing in terms of say the new kind of say wave that's coming in terms of say Gen AI, LLMs, and so on. So yeah, a little bit of a background about myself. I currently lead the machine learning initiatives inside Apollo. And for those of you who don't know, Apollo is a end-to-end GTM platform that helps you do prospecting, engagement, deal management, and so much more. And if you look at say kind of what happens underneath Apollo, right, in terms of the machine learning itself, right, there is search, there is recommendation, there is conversation intelligence, there is generative AI for say content generation and whatnot. And prior to that, I spent about a year at Microsoft through an acquisition of a startup called Ally.io. But before that, I spent about 7 plus years in Apple. Essentially built the federated search ranking relevance team for Siri, and also launched the freeform question answering for Siri as well. So, and prior to that, I was part of a startup called Topsy Labs, which got acquired by Apple, and there I was building say user demographic models for social content data, right? This is like 2010 2011, where we're trying to actually figure out who the user is, what their say demographic data is, by just looking at say the content that they're actually generating, right? So okay, we'll do a little bit of history, quick slide again. What better way to start your afternoon than with a history lesson, right? So again, during say the early say like 2000s and and whatnot, we saw a lot of say industry adoption for say classical ML models, right? Where we're looking at say patterns. Essentially, it was like kind of like high order say pattern matching in terms of recognizing patterns and trying to optimize right your decision making. And then came say 2010s, where we had this huge spike of say adoption on neural networks, where we're trying to actually figure out how we can understand more complex interaction between say multiple factors. And then came transformers and BERT, and that kind of like opened up say the whole say LLM wave, right? And then came 2020, right, which is very very interesting time. So just about like 4 years in, and you see like almost every year kind of radically changing in terms of what AI actually is, right? For every single say GPT version, we have like a very different expectation in terms of what AI is actually supposed to do. The reason I kind of start with this is that what is considered as AI today is actually going to be table stakes tomorrow for your product, right? Because there's going to be a constant increased expectation in terms of how smart your product is expected to be, how intuitive your product is expected to be. Right. So when I look at say like building say impactful say AI features, I look at like these kind of three main themes in terms of like what actually creates a true impact. We'll start with say the first one, which is the problem definition itself. Right. So the statements on the left are say some of the statements that I've actually heard people say, right? Obviously, some of these are simplified and taken a little bit out of context, but I've heard someone say, hey, we cannot actually release this to production because it's not using RAG. Or someone says, hey, it's time to actually introduce another vector DB, and now it's just AI agents all along, right? But the main challenge or problem that I see with statements like this is that it's not necessarily following a first principle thinking, right? You're not starting with a user problem, right? What is actually the user problem that you're solving that is actually going to be solved better by some of these tools out there? So yeah, like there's so many instances that I've been able to actually push back on the team to say, hey, it's not the right time to actually do RAG, at least for this particular problem, right? Can we actually do something simpler, say, increasing your context model or whatnot? And again, I know that vector DB is all the rage, but if you look at say any production scale search systems, they still very much rely on say a hybrid model of text-based search and starting to use vector search as well. And we'll talk about AI agents a bit more in depth, but kind of say the core question is, do you actually have a complex decision-making process in your platform that actually requires an AI agent? So yeah, I know that there's a lot of FOMO. There's say a new concept that's introduced almost every other day. The question is, do you actually have a user problem that is directly addressed by whatever say this technology that you're trying to introduce? Right. So The second half of, say, the whole problem definition itself is how well you're able to translate your business problem into a machine learning problem. It's actually easier said than done, because almost every single, say, ML problem could be construed as a different problem, right? Every search could be construed as a recommendation problem, every classification could be construed as a ranking problem, and so on. So almost any problem you make a small tweak and like change, into a different problem altogether. So kind of the biggest question is how well you're translating your business problem into a machine learning problem. So almost like 3 years back, I was consulting for a matchmaking app, and they had a lot of, say, machine learning engineers. They're building models and so on, but no matter, say, how much they improve their models, their online metric was not actually improving. In fact, they started seeing a decline on, say, what your online metric is, when they actually, start to push a model that is actually doing better. So again, the team started kind of trying to actually go after more data, going after, say, more complex models and whatnot. But when we kind of like take a step back and see what is actually doing, we saw there's a mismatch in terms of what the business outcome is and what the model is actually trying to do. So what we actually did is kind of like take a step back and say, hey, let's actually have this cost function, right, truly reflect what your business outcome is. Right? They had like this very kind of like crazy, the business metric and whatnot that they're trying to optimize. So we kind of started redefining the problem so that there is a higher, harmony between, say, your business outcome and your model outcome. And again, to no surprise, we kind of switched this, and with much less data, with much simpler model, we started to see more online metric moving in the right direction. So again, as obvious as it might seem, if something is actually core to your business, then you have to constantly kind of think in terms of whether you're actually translating it the right way. And in my experience, some of the big problems, we have to do at least, like, say, 2 to 3 iterations to actually really get it right. And again, second thing is little boring, not as fancy as, say, models and whatnot, but again, this makes a huge impact. The difference between, say, building, say, an AI feature versus, say, building, say, any other feature is that every single iteration you're constantly refining your model or your behavior or whatnot, right? And this refinement needs, say, iteration, and, say, the quicker that you can iterate, the faster that you can actually make progress, and the quicker that you can actually fail, right? Especially, right, so let's take the case of, prompt engineering, right? So, anyone who has actually worked on, say, any kind of production, say, prompt engineering, they'll understand that it's actually more art than science, right? There's no, like, say, kind of a very definite way of actually getting to a prompt that actually works best. Of course, there's, like, literature and whatnot that I can actually follow. So, which means what developers actually end up doing is they actually try to fix a problem, but they actually find a regression, a different use case altogether, right? So the sooner that you actually invest in terms of, say, your tools, your iteration, which could be, say, unit tests, which should be the end-to-end evals, whatever that you want to do, then the better that you'll be able to actually iterate faster and converge on, say, the right behavior much faster as well. Again, A/B test is something that should be the last frontier. That should be almost like, say, kind of, say, like a safeguarding, capability in terms of, say, checking whether something is not going wrong. But you should be able to tell that, hey, I'm actually making a difference in terms of, say, my behavior, right? Much sooner than that before it even gets to, say, production. Yeah. And the third one, again, as you all know, so any ML feature, any AI, it's not deterministic, right? So there's always like a bit of variance in terms of, like, how it behaves, right? Unlike, say, the standard applications, which means there is a difference between, say, what your application is doing and what your user's expected behavior is going to be, right? So there's always going to be a diff. So which means you should be tracking what the diff is. And the most ideal scenario is that your feedback should be flowing into your system automatically and automatically making a model better, right? In one of the really big features that we built in Apple, we'd used to see that, say, there's like let's say CTA, for example, right? The CTA is actually, I'd say, like, like 30%, and we would see that, say, the CTA is like constantly improving, right? Or like, the next like 6 to 9 months in terms of, because the feedback is constantly making this model better. And of course, it's going to cap out at some point in time. Then you have to go back and see, hey, why is it like, plateauing and whatnot? But this feedback is going to be like super, super key, right? because again, users, it's going to be very, very hard to actually have a system that's going to work well, in the first place. And say the sooner that you build a feedback system, then you have a better chance in terms of improving things in production. And the other, say, challenging aspect about feedback is that you need to actually handle both qualitative as well as quantitative feedback, right? I've seen, say, people who actually focus on the one and not the other. Again, ML engineers, they love, say, quantitative feedback. They'll say, hey, what, I'm like at X% accuracy, Y% recall, and whatnot. Whereas, say, on say on the less technical side of the spectrum, people that say, hey, what, I tried a particular example, they did not work, and so on, right? So, but the right way to kind of zero in on, say, getting the right product market fit is that you should be able to handle both, right? Now, what are actually the real world scenarios that something is failing? You should have examples in terms of, hey, what, in this particular user input scenario, my response is suboptimal. Again, at the same time, you should be able to quantify in terms of, hey, for scenarios X, Y, and Z, this is what they are contributing in terms of, say, the overall error rate. So this combination is going to be the killer combination. So again, that's another thing that you have to focus on. And again, your app should be able to capture both these, right, on a continuous basis. I think the clicker is not responding. Let's see. I don't think the clicker is working. Can you go to the next slide from there? I can just tell you when to move. All right. Okay, so I spoke a little bit in terms of, say, some of the learnings that I had in terms of, say, building, say, more classical, say, ML models and whatnot, and look into, say, how some of the learnings are actually going to be and how things are different, when you talk about, say, LLMs and agents and some of the new trend that we're actually seeing. Right. So, I mean, one trend that I'm observing, I don't know if it's a very global observation, is that see a lot of, say, new companies that's coming in that's able to actually make a better use of, say, LLMs and Gen AI and whatnot, compared to, say, some of the existing companies, right? There are like a lot of reasons, right? So good, the agility to move, your tech debt, and as whatnot, right? But one, I'd say, kind of underlooked aspect is that new apps are actually building, say, their workflows and UX that's more, say, Gen AI native, right? Because the paradigm is kind of changing completely in terms of when you talk about, say, LLMs, when you talk about, say, agents and whatnot. So one thing that, especially for people who are actually building, say, new products, right, you should think about, say, what is actually the right, say, UX and workflow that fits this new paradigm, right? Because a lot of things have actually changed in this new world. So if you're trying to actually shoehorn, say, these features into, say, your existing flows, your impact is going to be, say, much smaller than what you would actually expect. And what does it mean, right? So again, when you talk about, say, things like agents and whatnot, you should have like a lot of, say, kind of the back and forth between, say, the user and, say, and the app, and you're essentially kind of like directing your app towards the right direction, right? So that's kind of, say, the paradigm that you should be thinking about. And you should build for, say, the non-deterministic behavior, right? Because no matter, say, how great your model is, you fine tune and whatnot, LLMs have a pretty high error rate, right? The error rate that's actually not, something that's unheard of, right? So, Yashwant is talking about, say, 99.99 is, SLAs, right? But, if your model works like 90% of the time, then, boom, right? You've actually, hit the jackpot. So that's kind of something that you have to build into your application in terms of how do you handle failures, how do you give feedback. And I think definitely, say, the paradigm itself in terms of the relational nature of, say, data itself is going to change. Now that we're thinking in terms of, say, embeddings and in terms of the new paradigm itself. So how your core UI looks like, even that is going to change pretty dramatically. And I don't necessarily mean that everything is going to be a natural language chat interface. I think that fad has actually passed. So, but yeah, definitely the new UX is the way to go. All right. So coming out kind of the last few slides. So yeah, again, AI agents is really a big thing. It was a big thing almost like a year ago with, say, an auto GPT and so on. It was, little bit of the sidelines for a bit, and now it's kind of like re-emerged. Right. So what are AI agents, right? So agents are essentially your autonomous programs, right? That can give a task, that it can actually plan its activity, take actions, reverse its decisions, and essentially give an outcome that is going to be not easy with, say, a standard traditional, say, programming. So again, lot of say concepts out there. People have agents, there are crews, there are tasks, there is workflows, and so much that's actually built. But agents in its like core bare bones, I just see these like four main say components. Right. First is, of course, right, you tell your agent what to do, and you're essentially giving, say, natural language instructions, and it's going to be a prompt friendly way. And second is, people talk about tools, and tools are essentially just APIs, right? Your agents can actually call APIs, and you give any API, your agent should be able to actually call it. And then you have a validation step, right? So something that tells you in terms of, hey, you have, say, this step that determines whether your task is actually done to your satisfaction, right? And then the agents can actually iterate until it actually, gets to that satisfactory level. So those are kind of the core bare bones. So how does it convert into your framework itself, right? How does it convert into your, actual application? So the first thing is there an API framework that your agents can actually invoke, right? Because it needs to interact with your application, right? And so, yeah, it's a leading question. The answer is no. Agents are not, again, agents are actually good with natural languages. They are not so good with the APIs. So, which means you have to kind of rethink your API architecture in such a way that it's more, say, agent compatible. And that's going to be, say, a non-trivial amount of, say, work in terms of, say, how do you actually make, say, your API to be like much more simple for an agent to understand, and how do you actually get your agent to understand your response, right, from your API? Because a lot of, say, some of the common world use case that you would see with agents and so on is, hey, most of them are like, dealing with like some kind of a web search, right, in one way or the other. And web search API is actually the most simple. You just give like one search query, and agents can easily understand the response because it's just a blob of text, exactly the text and that, say, the agents are actually, your LLMs are actually trained on. So that's actually something that's going to be dramatically different in terms of, say, the API framework that you want your agents to actually use. And second is, again, going back to, say, something I talked about, do you actually have a complex decision-making process, right? The question is it complex enough that it needs a non-deterministic, say, agent behavior, or is it something that it can actually change like multiple steps together and kind of achieve the same thing? This is going to be a very, very critical question because, again, there are a lot of use cases, with more effort, arguably more effort, you can actually build it without an agent. But yeah, so that's something that you need to ask. And the last thing is, do you have a clear definition of success, right? That's actually much more harder, than what it sees to be. So let's take the case of, say, a trip building, a trip planning agent, for example, right? Can agents actually plan a trip, book a trip? Yeah, sure. I don't think that's actually a hard thing at all, right? But can it actually book a trip that is actually up to a human satisfaction, right? That's actually the hard problem. The reason why it's a hard problem is that you have to actually encode, say, what is satisfactory for a human in a way that machines can understand, right? So if you're someone who's, say, kind of an expert traveler, right? So then you have your list of preferences in terms of, say, from the airlines to the kind of destinations, your layover times and whatnot. And you have to find the right balance between your cost and luxury and comfort, right? And if you're able to kind of encode that into, say, a prompt, and you're able to actually evaluate, say, the trip that your agent actually generates, and to say, hey, what, I evaluated this trip, this is where you're actually not satisfactory, go back and fix it, then that's something that's more likely to actually work. So that's going to be a very, very hard problem because, again, it's very hard for, say, to encode, say, what the user expectation is, and if you're able to successfully do so, then that iteration process can actually work, and then you'll have, say, the agents eventually succeeding. Right. So, yeah, been working with, say, LLMs in one way or the other for the last few years, and these are some of the learnings and a little bit of hot take as well. The first is, again, very contrary to, say, what the previous talk was. Again, I'd say cost is actually a non-factor. Again, exceptions do apply because either say you're building something that's of value to the user that the user is actually willing to pay for, or you're building something that's not of value, which means, hey, this is something that you should be spending money on, right? And second is cost is something that we constantly keep seeing going down. Um, yeah, of course, GP is actually getting like much more efficient and much more cheaper, and definitely that at least for the next 2 years, you'll actually see like dramatic, cost reductions. So that's one. And second is, yeah, I'd say we've definitely evaluated a lot of vendors. There are a lot of vendors who would actually give, say, good cost savings in terms of like 25 to 30% and so on. You can go for cheaper models, fine-tuned models, and everything. But again, especially for someone who's actually like testing, say, new arenas, you're building new features and so on, I say stick with OpenAI, because again, the best gain that you get is in the order of like 25 to 30%, and even there also it's like it's like on a shaky ground. And again, the pace at which OpenAI is actually innovating, I'd say you're better off sticking with them. Yeah, kind of the contrary point. Again, we've definitely seen, say, latency is something that's very, very critical. Again, depends on, say, the use case itself, but we've seen, say, users preferring, say, 3.5 over 4 in some cases, because they didn't want to actually wait for another, say, 40-50 seconds, right, to actually get something done. So unless and until you're building something that's dramatically, say, better, I'd say latency is something that you have to be very, very cautious about, because otherwise your user adoption is going to drop. And lastly, for anyone who's actually building with AI as core, you're solving a problem that you think is best solved with AI, and that's actually your core focus. I say, again, contrary to the public opinion, you would want to build your own frameworks, because we've seen, say, people hitting the cap rather, say, soon in terms of, say, trying to actually adopt the existing frameworks, right? And when you talk about frameworks and talking about, say, your evaluation framework, for example, right? There's a lot of, it's a very, very hot area. Everyone is trying to actually build an eval tool that can magically evaluate everything and tell you something is working or not. But unfortunately, the reality is much more tricky and complex than that. And second is even, say, the agent frameworks, right? You definitely started seeing, say, some companies who are actually building a real production ready, say, agent applications with their own framework. They're not necessarily actually, relying on something like, say, Crew or LangChain or whatnot. Again, something that you think is that's going to be, say, the core focus area of your application. And even in terms of fine tuning and whatnot, right? Again, a lot of frameworks out there. But again, if that's something that you're doing, for example, we build a lot of models. So we build, say, thousands of models, and we did invest in terms of, say, building our own, say, fine tuning, platform or whatnot, because that actually is what is working best for us. And we try to actually go to, say, another vendor to say, what, hey, do you have, say, a platform that can handle a few thousand models at a time? That did not work for us. So yeah, right. So if AI is actually your moat, then again, if you have, say, expert developers, then do consider, say, building your framework. Yeah, so I think I believe that's the last slide. Oh no, yeah, there's one more. Right, so again, so you have all these kind of major trends, right, in terms of, say, the generative AI that can write your email, write your blog post, and whatnot, and the agents and all these big concepts. But one kind of, say, trend that we are seeing in for a place like Apollo, right, is that we're starting to actually improve, say, our user interaction with much more, say, smaller usage of LLMs, right? This is again, right, can you actually land the user in a better, empty state, right? Can you actually guess in terms of, hey, this is what the user's background is, this is what the industries and so on. Can we actually land them in a page with a lot of things filled out? Can we show just leads, right, before the user even does anything, right? They just sign up, and then we have 1,000 leads, right, that we think is relevant to you. Or what, can I actually start to use LLMs to normalize data, right? That's something we started doing crazy amount, right? Now no one is writing regex or whatnot, right? Everything is just LLMs. And yeah, right, now use freeform inputs whenever necessary. Again, you're not going to replace with a complete, say, chatbot, but definitely wherever it's going to be easy, it's going to be easier for the user to actually give a freeform input. Then it's better to do so, and we can actually handle the complexity. And again, right, do, say, intelligent input validation and so on. So that's kind of, say, the other trend that we are seeing is that, hey, not everything is a kind of central, say, kind of LLM usage. You can actually start to think of this like a fancy regex, right? If not anything else, that you can start to incorporate, and you can start make your app more and more intelligent. All right, and I think that's pretty much it. Right, so I think we have probably a few minutes in terms of any questions. Yep. probably want to wait for the mic.
I think you mentioned about the non-deterministic nature of the LLM, especially these days, right? And it's very valid. And most of the product companies like who are leveraging LLMs seem to be solutioning it in the similar way, right? Like, for example, saying that, okay, it is non-deterministic. For example, the Microsoft Copilots, right? They give the responsibility to the user or make it as a shared responsibility, right? How are you approaching in practical ways to make it a little bit more deterministic? Because not all AI solutions are like chat-based, right? So at one point in time, you may have to trigger some APIs or solutions based on a higher confidence, right? So how are you approaching it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I wish I had like a very easy answer. It depends in terms of the use case, right? For example, a lot of these, like, let's talk about like normalization, say like other simple use cases, right? I have this like free-form data. I have like normalized into a particular construct, right? So there, again, we typically go for say spotted models for cost, and they're also actually having say much more deterministic behavior. And again, fine-tuning is something that's going to give you like a lot of control, right? So the more and more say you can actually fine-tune, essentially you're kind of like forcing the model to say, what, this is kind of the spectrum of say action that I'm actually doing, and that way you actually get more control. When you think about say, Gen AI, sort of like truly generative use cases, right? So that's where things like say like React and everything, there's like the prompt framework called React, that is something that's becoming like very, very now popular, right? So there's like the prompting techniques that's actually becoming better and better in terms of say getting that input, and that's also where the agents is kind of say starting to actually be interesting, right? Which is your LM output is not going to be right the first time, but if you have a validation step, you keep validating until it gets to say that kind of standard, right? So that is again, so you start from say fine tuning, then you have prompting technique, and then you have agents, and of course, right, everything has like say an additional cost in terms of what you can afford.
Yeah, but sometimes I feel like that's also a Pandora box, right? If you think about the older ways of us developing solutions, we had a defined framework. For example, in terms of testability, operational readiness, coverage in terms of quality, etc. But with the Gen AI models, like a lot of these are black box, right? Like how do you know, like, the fine tuning is good enough, whether it is ready for production, right? Before you get sued or something, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's where your iteration and say the whole evaluation framework actually comes into
But is there a standard that is already present? Like,
no, yeah. So again, the more say free form say content generation it actually becomes, say the more harder it is for you to eval. Right, and again, one of the reasons why we had the slide in terms of, hey, you probably want to build your own frameworks is kind of, we got burnt by the fact that we thought there's like in some eval framework out there that's going to solve that problem for us, right? So, for example, when we started kind of like building the whole email generation model, then we tried so much, and then we thought, hey, it's just not improving, and we started building another product that said, hey, what? Now we'll just take a user email and we know what kind of email actually works well, right? So there's an email analyzer product that we built that say, hey, what? I'm going to analyze all these like millions of emails and what actually gives you your response and whatnot. Then we're going to figure out what are the right say characteristics of those emails, and we built them. They kind of like happened in a disjoint way. Right. And then we thought, what? Hey, now that we actually have, say, this tool, rather we have the product that we have built to say analyze emails, we'll use that as a feed to the email generation itself. So now the email is actually getting generated. We're giving the feedback from, say, this email analyzer, and that's how it gets better. But the thing is, we actually had to build that product to actually get the eval framework in. So in short, the answer is actually going to be hard, right? So the more freeform your task is, the more harder it is. That's why I focus on the validation step for the the trip generation, the bot, right? So yeah, so the more say robust your validation framework is, then you'll be able to validate. And in fact, when you look at the tools that does validation, almost one of the core criteria that I had is that it should be very simple for a human to actually go and evaluate, right? Because like some say very obvious behaviors your tools can actually can catch, but there is obviously something that humans can only catch. For example, can generate an email that like fix, that like sets all these like exact boundaries in terms of the length and the tone and whatnot. That whether it's actually creative or not, right? Whether it's actually robotic versus say creative, that's actually a very very hard thing only humans can do. So yeah, so you can actually save your time in terms of building a lot of automated tools. But then you have to always have, say, human validation if it's going to be a free-form task. If it's not a free-form task, then yeah, there's the standard, say, machine learning, say, your test set and eval set and everything, does apply.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Yes.
Hey, so as a user of Apollo, I'm very curious to understand how you're thinking about agent workflows. And your answer will help me think about agent workflows, my own product. So any examples that you have in Apollo itself right now?
Right. So I hope I'm not telling something that's not really. So yeah, I mean, yeah. So again, I talked about the defaults, right? So when the user signs up, right? So imagine saying you have to actually figure out in terms of hey, which keywords to search for, which industries, which technologies. Again, for like expert SDRs, that's like kind of natural. They kind of do this like day in and day out. But for say a founder who's kind of trying to actually set up their first campaign, right? For users who are like new to say the whole say the SDR process itself, we want to actually come up with say like a great default in terms of what are the prospects that that is going to be relevant to you, right? So you sign up, you land, boom, right? You have like thousands say prospects that's actually relevant to you. And the way that we did that was interesting. So we had we have a lot of models that actually looks at say someone's activity in terms of, hey, you reached out to say like 1,000 people, like there's like 200 people responded to your email and so on. We have this activity data, and we build models for all our paying customers, right? We build an automatic model that says what this contact is like like highly relevant versus medium versus whatnot. So we had this when we have activity data. So what we did is we actually built an agent infrastructure that actually goes to your website, researches everything about you, and says, now I'm actually trying to create this model for you, right? So it kind of like bridges the classical ML and say, the new, the new wave, say, agent architecture. And this agent has the feedback in terms of when it's actually creating something that actually is of relevance to this particular user. So it constantly has this feedback. So if you do this deterministically, then essentially the whole problem is that your iteration loop is missing, which means you will be able to do say probably like a 60% accuracy. But when we actually start implementing this agent architecture, we're able to get like 80% accuracy compared to say what we had. So that's like one thing that we're doing. But yeah, that's just one of the kind of say like early teasers. But again, this area is definitely going to change. Now we're thinking of like what is the right thing that's kind of the right balance in terms of the Copilot and something that could like really simplify a complex decision making inside the product. So that's like one place that we use. Right. Yeah. So it did. Right. So yeah, because obviously the one of the most easiest ways in which say the agent actually fails is that it creates a model that is actually not compatible with say what we want, right? So that's one area that actually failed. And when it tries to actually automatically update the model, the API fails. So we had to kind of like simplify things in such a way that it made very simple for the agent to use. So because yeah, when we actually build an API, again, I think I should just talk about say the APIs that internal teams can use. But yeah, it takes even more say simplification for say agents to use, because the agents cannot like send like 10 parameters to an API to actually like do like go and like update a record. That's just not possible. It's going to fail much more often. So you have to really, really simplify your APIs to actually have agents, invoke it automatically.
Hi, myself Rahul. So just wanted to know, I think you have written user-centric solutions. I think, and I noticed few words from your presentation. One is like complex, long form, non-deterministic, right? So currently most of the websites, when we see, there is a small chatbot kind of thing in the bottom right. So how far do you see this where this becomes the center and the UI is like secondary? Like for example, booking an Uber, like it's very deterministic. Why will I even go for an AI solution, right? But there, I mean, there are talks about that happening in the future. So how do you see that evolving? And is there any customer that you had which basically had this kind of a shift till now?
Right. So again, little bit of a personal opinion. So again, when when say GPT-3 and 3.5 came along, that was the prediction, right? So everyone thought everyone was just going to like move to say the whole natural language interface. My simple answer to that is that it's actually much more harder to type a long query than to just go click on buttons, right? And we're also kind of used to this pattern in terms of, hey, I'm going to click like button X, Y, and Z, I'm going to get something done. But if you're trying to describe the same thing as a natural language text, it actually takes, say, more effort from the user. Of course, you have the voice interface and everything, but no one has voice and uses voice interface to interact with websites. So that's why at least my imagination is it's going to be more of a hybrid thing, right? So we do use, say, natural language input wherever we think it's going to be harder for user to describe something. For example, ICP, right? So you can say, hey, I can like go and like pick like 10 different filters to say, hey, this is what my ICP is, or I can actually write, say, a text in terms of what my ICP is, and we understand in terms of how that translates into a filter. So that's like one particular area where we think that, hey, what's harder for, say, users to actually go and just like find all the titles that's related to say the target title that you're actually looking for, as opposed to say, I have this description in terms of what this role is going to do, and then we figure out in terms of what are the titles that it's actually going to map to. So yes, it's going to change, but yeah, whether it's actually going to change to say like a full natural language interface, yeah, I mean, I'll be damned if I'm wrong, but yeah, at least it has not happened so far, right? Despite waiting for almost like a year and a half.
Sure, thanks, makes sense.